Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive? We've got a really thought-provoking editorial we're digging into today. It's called Secularism or Vote Bank Politics, India's Dilemma.
Oh, wow. That title itself sounds like it's going to be a fascinating one.
Right, and it gets even more interesting when you realize it was published just last month, September 2024, in PreSense.
Right.
You know, that eMagazine for the Prime Point Foundation?
Yeah, I've seen those. Definitely a group that dives deep into complex issues.
Yeah, totally. And Prime Point Srinivasan, he's the managing editor. He really doesn't shy away from the tough questions here.
So what's the angle? What's Prime Point Srinivasan focusing on?
Well, he starts off by saying he thinks the whole idea of secularism in India, like how it's actually playing out and it's getting kind of twisted, like, is it about true equality or is it just a political game?
That's a big question, and a timely one, especially with everything going on.
Exactly. And he uses, get this, that recent statement from the Tamil Nadu minister, the one about wanting to, get rid of Sanatana Dharma.
Oh, right. The one that sparked all those protests and legal battles. Yeah, that was definitely attention-grabbing.
Totally. And Prime Point Srinivasan, he uses that whole controversy as kind of a jumping-off point. He's basically saying it's a prime example of what he's talking about.
So he sees it as politicians using religion, using people's beliefs to get ahead.
Yeah, it's this whole thing about appeasing certain religious groups just for votes, and he's saying that's not real secularism.
Interesting. So how does he back that up? What's he pointing to?
Well, he gives a bunch of examples, right? Like he talks about how some politicians will publicly make fun of Hindu traditions, but then they'll bend over backwards to celebrate festivals from other faiths.
He's saying there's a double standard.
Exactly. And then he points to how some political parties that call themselves secular, they're totally silent when there's violence against Hindus.
That's a bold claim. Does he get into specifics?
He does. He even brings up the exodus of Kashmiri Pandits in the 1990s. Really heavy stuff.
Wow. Okay. So he's not holding back. But then doesn't he bring up Dr. B.R. Ambedkar? That's got to be complicated.
Right. Because Ambedkar, he wrote the Indian Constitution and he was all about secularism. But here's the thing.
What? Don't tell me.
He never actually used the word secularism in the Constitution's preamble.
Wait, seriously, that seems, I don't know, kind of contradictory, doesn't it?
It does, right? But Prime Point Srinivasan, he says Ambedkar believed the whole idea of secularism. It was already woven into the Constitution's fabric, especially in those articles 25 to 28, the ones about religious freedom for everyone.
Right. Guaranteeing those basic rights.
Interesting. And there's this quote from Ambedkar that Prime Point Srinivasan uses, however much one might dislike religious dogmas, our Constitution has rightly decided to guarantee religious freedom.
It's like he's saying you don't have to agree with everyone's beliefs, but everyone gets to have them.
Yeah, and the state, the government, shouldn't play favorites.
Okay, so that's Ambedkar's view, but then what about this editorial? Where's Prime Point Srinivasan going with all this?
Well, he actually says that adding the word secular later on, during Indira Gandhi's time, it might have been a mistake.
Whoa, hold on. A mistake? How so?
He thinks it muddied the waters. Before it was about building the society where everyone was equal, but then
it became about politics.
Exactly. And that's what he calls appeasement. It's instead of lifting everyone up, you focus on one group just to get their votes.
And he's saying that's what's happening in India today.
That's his argument. He says it's this whole thing where, look, he even says ancient India, they had this tradition of tolerance, of different beliefs coexisting. Ancient India, way back.
Way back. And he contrasts that with what he sees happening now. And it's not pretty. It's like he's saying we've strayed from our roots,
Yeah, I get it. Instead of building on that history of tolerance, he's saying it's we've gone backward. Totally. And he's not just talking in generalities here. He gets into some pretty specific examples of how he sees this playing out.
Like what?
Well, he talks about how the government, how they handle, Hindu temples compared to other religious institutions.
Oh, interesting. What's his take on that?
He says it's totally uneven, there's no level playing field. And he even says it's not just about temples. It's about, education, funding, even how different communities are portrayed in the media.
So he's seeing this kind of, systemic bias, and it's all tied back to this idea of appeasing certain groups for votes.
Right. That's the root of the problem, according to him.
Wow. Okay, so that's a pretty strong argument he's making there.
It is. But here's the thing about Prime Point Srinivasan. He's not just pointing fingers, he actually offers up some solutions too.
Oh, yeah.
Like what? Well, first off, he says all political parties, they got to stop using secularism as this, like, tool. Stop this whole appeasement thing.
Yeah.
Treat everyone equally no matter what their religion.
Which, yeah, in a perfect world, of course. But how do you get there? India's so diverse, it's got to be more complicated than just saying, be fair.
He acknowledges that. He says it has to be a group effort, not just politicians, but the media, regular people, even religious leaders.
What, like they all have to buy in for this to work?
Exactly. He even calls out leaders from minority communities, says they should be the first ones to shut down any, like, hateful stuff said about Hindus.
So it's like building that respect from both sides.
That's what he's saying. Like, true secularism can't be forced. Everyone has to feel respected and valued.
Interesting. Does he get into any, like, specific policies that can help with all this?
He does. Remember how we were talking about Dr. Ambedkar earlier?
Yeah, the whole Constitution connection.
Well, Prime Point Srinivasan, he's a big proponent of a uniform civil code. You know, that whole idea that Ambedkar himself was pushing for.
Right, like one set of laws for everyone, regardless of religion. That's a hot topic.
It is. And Prime Point Srinivasan, he even quotes Ambedkar from way back in 1949, talking about how important it is to protect the unity of the nation.
So is he saying that a uniform civil code, that's the way to do it?
It's definitely a big part of his vision. Like, it would create this system where everybody's on the same page, legally speaking, no matter their faith.
But that's also something that makes a lot of people nervous, right? Like, they worry it'll take away their religious freedom.
Or absolutely, he recognizes that. He even says that any move towards a uniform civil code, it can't be top down. You can have open conversations, get everyone on board.
Which makes sense, given his whole thing is about making sure everyone feels included, right?
Exactly. And this is where I think this editorial gets really interesting. It's not that Prime Point Srinivasan's against secularism. Not at all.
It's more like he's challenging us to think about whether the way it's playing out now, is it really achieving what it's supposed to?
Right. Like, is it about true equality, or has it just become this, like, game of politics and power?
And that's the question, isn't it?
It's almost like he's saying, look, we all want this idea of a secular India, but are we going about it the right way?
Exactly. And are we being honest with ourselves about the challenges? Because it's not just about passing laws, it's about changing mindsets, really.
Totally. And this is where I think Prime Point Srinivasan brings it back to Dr. Ambedkar in such a powerful way. Like, he quotes Ambedkar saying, by secular state, we mean that state shall not have any religion of its own.
Wow, yeah, that's a pretty clear statement right there.
Right. No playing favorites, no special treatment.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, are we living up to that vision today?
That's the question, isn't it? Are we truly treating everyone as equals, regardless of their faith? Or have we let things slip?
I mean, I don't know if we have the answer to that, but I think Prime Point Srinivasan is right to at least make us ask it.
Absolutely. And even though he lays out some pretty heavy stuff in this editorial, it's not like he ends on a totally bleak note either.
No, not at all. He ends with that line from the Upanishads, the one about, may all be happy. It's kind of hopeful, even after everything he's just said.
It is. Like, he's acknowledging how hard it is, how complex it all is, but there's still that hope for something better.
Yeah, and maybe that's what we need to hold on to. That even with all the challenges, all the disagreements, that desire for a truly inclusive society, it's still there.
It has to be, right? Otherwise, what are we even doing here?
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, having these tough conversations, really grappling with these ideas, that's a step in the right direction.
Couldn't agree more. It's about listening, learning, and trying to understand each other, even when it's difficult.
And on that note, I think we'll leave it to our listeners to keep this conversation going. What resonated with you? What are your thoughts on the future of secularism in India? We always love hearing from you.
Always.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a thought-provoking one for sure. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and most importantly, keep talking to each other.